April 15th, 1944, 30,000 feet above Germany. The Messerschmitt pilot from Munich saw them first, silver dots catching sunlight like scattered coins across the blue. He'd been flying for 3 years, shot down 17 bombers, survived 200 missions. The dots weren't B-17s. They moved wrong, turned too sharp, climbed too fast. His wingman, a kid from Hamburg who'd joined up 6 weeks ago, asked what they were. The veteran didn't answer because he didn't know. In 30 seconds, he'd learned these were P-51 Mustangs, and everything the Luftwaffe thought it knew about controlling German skies was about to end. The first burst of 50 caliber rounds passed 3 feet from his canopy. The American pilot, a farm boy from Nebraska named William Preddy, had climbed 2,000 feet in the time it took the German to check his fuel gauge. The Messerschmitt supercharger screamed as the pilot yanked the stick back, pulling 7 Gs in a climbing turn that had saved him a dozen times before. The Mustang followed him up, matching every move, engine purring like it was out for a Sunday drive. At 40,000 feet, where the Messerschmitt should have had every advantage, the American was still there, still climbing, still shooting. The kid from Hamburg died first. 1 second he was flying formation, the next his plane was coming apart in pieces, wings separating from fuselage in a slow-motion ballet of destruction. No parachute. The veteran from Munich dove hard, pushing his fighter past its limits, airframe shaking like it might tear itself apart. The Mustang followed him down, patient as death. At 15,000 feet, the German pilot tried his last trick, a snap roll into a split S that had shaken British Spitfires 100 times. The American stayed glued to his tail. The next burst didn't miss. Major Hermann Buchner watched from 8 miles away through his gun sight. 28 years old, Knight's Cross with oak leaves, one of 12 pilots in the Luftwaffe, with over 200 confirmed kills. He'd flown in Spain, Poland, France, Britain, Russia. Never seen anything like these new American fighters. His squadron of 8 had bounced what they thought were easy targets, American bombers separated from their formation, sitting ducks at 25,000 feet. The Mustangs had appeared from nowhere. Now he had 3 pilots left, and they were running for their lives. The mathematics were simple and brutal. A Messerschmitt Bf-109G could fly 385 miles per hour at 20,000 feet. The P-51D Mustang could do 437. The German fighter had a range of 350 miles. The Mustang could fly 1,650 miles with drop tanks. The Messerschmitt's twin 13mm machine guns and single 20mm cannon gave it 800 rounds total. The Mustang carried 650 caliber machine guns with 400 rounds each, 2,400 rounds of American manufacturing precision. But numbers didn't tell the real story. The real story was about 15,000 American pilots arriving over Germany with 4 years of training, flying machines built in factories the Germans couldn't touch, burning fuel refined from Texas oil, guided by British radar technology. The real story was the war had already been lost. The Germans just didn't know it yet. Captain Hans Dortenmann pulled his oxygen mask tighter and checked his altitude. 32,000 feet over Frankfurt. Below him, 60 B-17 flying fortresses lumbered toward the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt. 6 months ago, this would have been a turkey shoot. The bombers would have been alone, defenseless, once German fighters got past their gunners. Today, Dortenmann counted 40 Mustangs weaving above the bomber formation. He had 6 planes. The math teacher from Dresden knew those odds without calculating. He'd met his first Mustang 3 weeks ago over Berlin, still had nightmares about it. The American had come out of the sun, oldest trick in the book, but moved like nothing Dortenmann had ever encountered. The German had been flying since 1940, 400 missions, 93 confirmed kills. The American pilot looked about 19, flew like he was born in that cockpit. They'd danced for 12 minutes at 30,000 feet, Dortenmann burning through his ammunition and most of his fuel trying to get a clear shot. The American had toyed with him, could have killed him 3 times, finally waggled his wings and broke off when Dortmund's fuel warning light came on. Message clear. You're alive because I let you live. The shame burned worse than any wound. Dortmund had landed with 2 minutes of fuel remaining, hands shaking so bad he couldn't unbuckle his harness. His crew chief, an old sergeant who'd been maintaining fighters since the Spanish Civil War, took one look at the bullet holes stitching patterns across the tail and said nothing. Everyone knew what those neat, grouped holes meant. The American had been practicing. Now Dortmund watched the Mustangs circle the bombers like sheepdogs. He keyed his radio, told his flight to maintain altitude, wait for an opening. There wouldn't be one. The Americans had learned from 2 years of watching the Luftwaffe. They stayed high, stayed patient, let the Germans come to them. When a Messerschmitt dove on the bombers, 2 Mustangs would bracket him. When he tried to climb away, 2 more would be waiting. It was systematic, methodical, utterly without mercy. Lieutenant Friedrich Haberlin had watched 17 of his friends die in the last month. The kid from Stuttgart was 22, ancient by current Luftwaffe standards. Most of his current squadron mates had less than 20 hours in a Messerschmitt before their first combat mission, 20 hours. The Americans were arriving with 200 hours minimum, many with 300 or more. They knew their planes like extensions of their bodies. The Germans were throwing children into machines they barely understood, hoping instinct and desperation could overcome training and technology. Haberlin remembered his instructor at flight school, a one-armed veteran of the Battle of Britain who told them the key to survival was knowing your aircraft's limits and never exceeding them. The problem was, the Mustang seemed to have no limits. It could turn with a Spitfire, dive like a Thunderbolt, climb like a Messerschmitt, and do it all while flying twice as far as any German fighter. Worst of all, it looked beautiful doing it. The Germans had always prided themselves on building the finest aircraft in the world. The Mustang made their best efforts look like antiques. The first time Haberlin encountered Mustangs, he'd been part of a 40-plane assault on a bomber formation over Hamburg. 40 of Germany's best remaining pilots in their newest fighters. The Americans had 12 Mustangs as escort. The Germans lost 22 planes. The Americans lost 1, and that pilot had collided with a bomber he'd just saved from destruction. The numbers didn't compute. It was like watching medieval knights charge machine gun positions. Today's mission was simpler. Stay alive. Haberlin had 7 gallons of fuel, enough for maybe 15 minutes of combat maneuvering. His ammunition load was down to 60%. There were no more full loads, not enough ammunition being produced to fill every fighter. His engine was running rough, needed an overhaul it would never get, because there weren't enough mechanics or spare parts. He was flying a dying machine for a dying regime, and across from him were Americans with unlimited fuel, unlimited ammunition, unlimited confidence. The radio crackled. Someone screaming about Mustangs diving from 40,000 feet. Haberlin looked up, saw nothing but sun glare. Then shadows flashed across his canopy. 4 Mustangs in perfect formation, approaching at over 500 miles per hour in a 60-degree dive. He had 2 seconds to decide, fight or run. The instructor from flight school whispered in his memory, "There's no shame in living to fight another day." But there wouldn't be another day. Everyone knew it. The Americans owned the sky from London to Berlin. The only question was how many more Germans would die learning that lesson. Haberlin pushed the stick forward, diving for the cloud layer at 15,000 feet. Behind him, his wingman, a 17-year-old who'd been pulled out of high school 2 months ago, tried to follow. The kid had 12 hours in a Messerschmitt. 12 hours. The Mustang pilot who killed him had 1,200 hours of flight time, 300 in combat. It wasn't a fight. It was an execution. Major Gunther Rahl stood in the operations room at Wiesbaden, staring at the map of Germany covered in red pins. Each pin was a crashed German fighter from the last week. 218 pins. He'd run out of red ones, had started using black pins from the bomber. Loss board. Those losses had dropped to almost nothing since the Mustangs arrived. The bombers flew in massive formations now, sometimes 1,000 planes, each group protected by dozens of fighters that could escort them all the way to Poland and back. Rahl had 273 confirmed kills, third highest in the Luftwaffe. He'd been shot down 8 times, wounded 3 times, broken his back in a crash that should have killed him. None of that mattered now. He commanded a fighter group that existed mostly on paper. Of the 40 planes he was supposed to have, 12 were flyable. Of the 40 pilots, 8 were combat ready. The rest were children and old men, instructors pulled from training schools, and transport pilots who'd never fired their guns in anger. He'd met his first Mustang 6 weeks ago, leading a desperate attack on bombers heading for the Messerschmitt factory at Augsburg. If they destroyed that factory, German fighter production would drop by 30%. Rahl had taken every available plane, 18 fighters scrapped together from 3 different units. The Americans had 50 Mustangs waiting. What happened next wasn't combat. It was a massacre presented as a tactical exercise. The American fighter leader, a colonel from Texas named Don Blakesley, had arranged his fighters in 3 layers. When the Germans climbed to attack, the high group dove on them. When they dove to escape, the low group climbed to meet them. The middle group stayed with the bombers, preventing any breakthrough. Rahl watched 14 of his 18 planes destroyed in 8 minutes. He survived only because his engine was hit early, forcing him to glide 40 miles to an emergency field. The new pilots didn't understand what they were facing. They'd grown up on stories of Luftwaffe victories, of German technical superiority, of pilots like Adolf Galland and Werner Mulders, who'd ruled the skies. They still believed skill and courage could overcome numbers and technology. Rahl knew better. He'd seen the future, and it was painted olive drab with American stars on its wings. The intelligence officer, a one-eyed veteran who'd been analyzing enemy aircraft since 1939, had broken down the Mustang's design. The airframe was British, based on specifications the RAF had provided to North American aviation. The engine was British too, a Rolls-Royce Merlin built under license in America, with improvements the British couldn't have imagined. The guns were a John Browning design from the last war, refined and perfected over 25 years. The gun sight was British, the radio American, the drop tanks inspired by Japanese designs from China. It was a mongrel that shouldn't work, every expert agreed. Except it did work. It worked better than anything anyone had ever built. But the real advantage wasn't technical. Rahl had captured documentation from a crashed Mustang that showed the pilot's training record, 400 hours of flight time before entering combat. 100 hours in the Mustang alone. Mock dogfights against experienced instructors, flying captured German aircraft. Gunnery practice until they could put 60% of their rounds on target at 300 yards. Navigation exercises over distances that would have taken them from London to Moscow. The Americans weren't just building better planes, they were building better pilots, and they were building them by the thousands. Captain Joseph Priller smoked his 3rd cigarette of the morning, watching the sunrise from the airfield at Lille. 29 years old, 101 confirmed kills, one of the few aces left from the glory days of 1940. He commanded 2 squadrons that morning, on paper. In reality, he had 4 serviceable fighters and 6 pilots, including himself. The Americans would be coming soon. They came every morning now, weather permitting. 800 bombers, 400 fighters, like clockwork. He'd first encountered Mustangs during Big Week in February, when the Americans had systematically destroyed the Luftwaffe's ability to defend Germany. 7 days of maximum effort by the Americans. 7 days that broke the back of German fighter strength. Priller had started that week with 32 planes. He ended it with 3. The mathematics of attrition were relentless. The Americans could lose 10 planes for every German and still win. They had Detroit, Seattle, Los Angeles churning out fighters faster than Germany could train pilots to fly the ones they had. The difference in quality was heartbreaking for someone who'd grown up believing in German engineering supremacy. Priller had examined a captured Mustang, gone over every rivet and wire with mechanics who'd been building aircraft since the Great War. The fit and finish were perfect. Every component over-engineered, built to last 5 times longer than necessary. The Germans were using substitute materials now, steel where there should be aluminum, wood where there should be steel. Their best engines lasted 50 hours before major overhaul. The Merlin in the Mustang was rated for 400 hours. Young Lieutenant Ernst Schroeder interrupted his thoughts, reporting 4 planes ready for takeoff. Schroeder was 19, had been flying combat for 3 weeks, somehow still alive despite odds that said he should have died 5 times over. The boy still believed they could win, still thought the secret weapons everyone whispered about would turn the tide. Priller didn't have the heart to tell him the truth, that even if Germany developed a jet fighter tomorrow, they had no fuel to fly it, no pilots to train on it, no factories safe enough to build it. The alarm bell rang. Radar had picked up the first wave of Americans crossing the Dutch coast. 300 miles away, but closing at 300 miles per hour. In an hour, they'd be overhead. Priller stubbed out his cigarette, strapped on his parachute. Another day of trying to stay alive in a sky owned by P-51 Mustangs. He'd known men who'd flown 100 missions, 200, even 300. None of them had faced anything like this. The Americans weren't just winning, they were demonstrating that everything Germany had achieved in 5 years of war could be erased in 5 months of systematic destruction. Walking to his fighter, Priller remembered something his father had told him after the last war. The old man had been an infantryman, spent 4 years in the trenches, came home missing a lung and most of his faith in human nature. "We didn't lose because we were weaker," he'd said. "We lost because they could replace their losses, and we couldn't." 30 years later, different war, same mathematics. The Mustang wasn't just a superior fighter, it was proof that American industrial capacity had reached a scale Germany couldn't match with slave labor and desperation. Major Walter Nowotny checked his instruments one more time. The Me-262 jet fighter was the Luftwaffe's last hope, capable of 540 miles per hour, 100 miles per hour faster than any Mustang. He was leading the first operational jet fighter unit in history, flying machines that made everything else obsolete. It should have been a moment of triumph. Instead, it felt like hospice care for a dying Air Force. The problem wasn't the jets. They worked, despite rushed development and substitute materials. The problem was everything else. They needed special fuel that Germany could barely produce. They needed runways 3 times longer than conventional fighters, runways that were perfect targets for American bombers. They needed experienced pilots to handle their unprecedented speed, but most experienced pilots were dead. Most of all, they needed time, and time was the one resource the Mustangs weren't giving them. Nowotny had shot down 258 aircraft, most of them on the Eastern Front, where a good pilot could still make a difference. He'd transferred west 6 months ago, started meeting Mustangs over Germany. It was like switching from boxing to gunfighting. The Russians flew with courage and determination, but little finesse. The Americans flew with mathematical precision, turning air combat into an industrial process. They had doctrine for everything: how high to fly, how to weave, when to engage, when to break off. They fought like they built cars, with standardized procedures and quality control. His first engagement in the Me-262 had been 3 days ago, 4 jets against 60 Mustangs escorting bombers to Munich. The speed advantage was real. He'd blown through their formation at 500 miles per hour, shot down a bomber, escaped before the escorts could react. But when he'd tried to set up another pass, the Mustangs were waiting. They'd learned his approach pattern after one attack, positioned themselves to cut off his escape routes. He'd barely made it home, engines overheating, fuel exhausted. The truth nobody wanted to admit was that the war in the air had been lost. This moment American long-range fighters appeared over Berlin. Everything since then was just the prolonged process of dying. The jets might shoot down a few bombers, might even survive encounters with Mustangs, but they couldn't change the arithmetic. America was producing 15,000 aircraft a month. Germany was producing 1,500, and half of those were being destroyed on the ground by American fighter bombers that roamed at will. Lieutenant Hermann Buchner watched his fuel gauge drop toward empty, calculating whether he had enough to reach the emergency field at Salzburg. Behind him, 3 Mustangs followed at a respectful distance, waiting for him to run dry. They could have killed him 10 minutes ago when they'd bounced his flight over Innsbruck. His wingman was already dead, plane cartwheeling into the Alps in a cascade of fire and aluminum. But these Americans seemed content to follow, force him to land or crash, minimize their own risk. It was humiliating. The Americans flew like accountants, measuring risk versus reward, never taking unnecessary chances. They knew they'd won, knew time was on their side, knew every German pilot killed today couldn't fly tomorrow. So they waited, patient as wolves, letting fuel starvation do their work for them. Buchner had grown up reading about Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, who'd ruled the skies through skill and courage. That was a different war, when individual excellence mattered. This war was about production statistics and fuel supplies, about who could train more pilots faster, about whether your factories were being bombed or doing the bombing. The Mustang was the perfect expression of that reality, not the best at anything specific, but good enough at everything, producible in vast numbers, flown by competent pilots who didn't need to be aces to be effective. His engine coughed, fuel pressure dropping, 10 miles to Salzburg, but the Mustangs had moved closer, boxing him in. If he tried to glide, they'd shoot him down. If he bailed out, even odds they'd strafe his parachute, not out of cruelty but practicality. A dead pilot couldn't fly again. A captured pilot consumed resources. The Americans had learned German ruthlessness and improved on it with American efficiency. The field appeared ahead, cratered from last night's bombing raid. Buchner lowered his landing gear, watching the Mustangs peel away. They'd accomplished their mission. One German fighter removed from action, one pilot forced to land at a damaged field with no fuel to take off again. They'd probably claim it as a kill in their after-action report, and they wouldn't be wrong. His war was over, ended not in a blaze of glory, but in the mundane mathematics of fuel consumption. Major Gerhard Barkhorn stood in the wreckage of what had been Germany's primary fighter training school, watching student pilots who'd never fly pick through debris for anything salvageable. The Americans had visited yesterday, not bombers, but Mustangs carrying 500-pound bombs, fighter bombers that could dogfight after dropping their ordnance. They'd destroyed 18 training aircraft on the ground, killed 6 instructors, cratered every runway. The school was finished. These student pilots would be sent to the infantry, where life expectancy was measured in weeks instead of hours. Barkhorn had 301 confirmed kills, second only to Erich Hartmann in the Luftwaffe's history. He'd survived 6 years of combat, been shot down 9 times, watched the Luftwaffe evolve from the world's premier air force to a hollow shell. The Mustang hadn't caused that decline, but it had accelerated it beyond recovery. Before the Mustang, German pilots could still contest the sky over Germany, still make Allied bombing costly enough to limit its effectiveness. After the Mustang, German airspace became an American shooting range. He'd analyzed the problem obsessively, looking for weaknesses to exploit. The Mustang's liquid-cooled engine was vulnerable to battle damage. One bullet in the cooling system, and it would seize within minutes. But you had to hit it first, and the American pilots had learned to attack from angles that minimized their exposure. The Mustang supposedly had poor visibility to the rear, but American pilots flew in formations that covered each other's blind spots. Every theoretical weakness had been negated by superior tactics and overwhelming numbers. The real genius of the Mustang wasn't its performance. Other planes flew faster, turned tighter, climbed quicker. The genius was its simplicity and reliability. It was easier to build than a Messerschmitt, easier to maintain than a Focke-Wulf, easier to fly than either. America had taken mass production principles from automotive manufacturing and applied them to fighter aircraft. The result was a plane that could be built by the thousands, flown by average pilots, maintained by mechanics with basic training, and still dominate the best Germany could produce. Captain Wilhelm Hoffmann led his last patrol over Stuttgart, 3 planes instead of the 12 he should have had. Below them, the city burned from last night's raid. 800 Lancasters protected by 100 Mosquitoes, the British taking the night shift while Americans owned the daylight. The Mustangs would arrive soon with their bomber fleets, adding to the destruction, grinding Germany into rubble, one city at a time. Hoffmann had met his first Mustang 4 months ago, leading an attack on bombers heading for the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt. He'd been confident then, veteran of 200 missions, wearing the Knight's Cross at his throat. The Americans were newcomers to European air combat, surely no match for Luftwaffe experience. That confidence died in about 30 seconds. The American pilot, Hoffmann never learned his name, flew like he'd been born in that Mustang, using its strengths, minimizing its weaknesses, never giving Hoffmann a clear shot while methodically destroying his squadron. 7 planes lost that day. Hoffmann survived by diving into clouds, using 20 years of experience to navigate by instruments while his attacker presumably gave up the chase. When he landed, his crew chief counted 47 bullet holes in his fighter. The American had been toying with him, could have killed him whenever he chose, was probably using him for gunnery practice. The psychological impact was worse than being shot down. The Americans weren't just better equipped, they were better trained, better organized, better at the systematic application of violence. The radio crackled with reports of incoming aircraft, hundreds of contacts, altitude 25,000 feet heading east. The morning parade was beginning. Hoffmann had 20 rounds of cannon ammunition, enough machine gun rounds for maybe 10 seconds of firing. His wingmen were in similar condition. They could make one pass at the bombers if they could get through the fighter screen, which they couldn't. But orders were orders, and maybe death in combat was better than surviving to see Germany's final humiliation. Climbing to intercept altitude, Hoffmann remembered his first combat mission in 1940, attacking British Wellingtons over the Channel. The RAF had been brave but outnumbered, their tactics outdated, their fighters outclassed. 4 years later, positions reversed, he finally understood how those British pilots had felt, knowing you're going to lose, knowing resistance is futile, but going up anyway because that's what warriors do. The Mustangs appeared above them, 60 at least, possibly more. Hoffmann waggled his wings, signaling his flight to turn back. No point in dying for nothing. The war was over. Everyone knew it, except Hitler. Colonel Johannes Steinhoff watched from his office window as ground crews pushed the last serviceable fighters into hidden revetments, covering them with camouflage netting that fooled nobody. The Americans had photographed every airfield in Germany, knew where every plane was hidden, could destroy them whenever they chose. They usually waited until just before a mission, maximizing psychological impact, ensuring German pilots knew their aircraft were death traps even on the ground. Steinhoff commanded what remained of Fighter Wing 7, once an elite unit with 90 aircraft and experienced pilots. Now he had 12 planes, half of them barely flyable, and pilots whose average age was 19 with less than 30 hours of combat experience. The Mustang had turned natural selection into a massacre. Good pilots, bad pilots, lucky pilots didn't matter. The Americans had achieved such numerical and qualitative superiority that individual skill was largely irrelevant. He'd been flying fighters since 1936, had 176 confirmed kills, had fought in every theater from Britain to Russia. Nothing had prepared him for the Mustang onslaught. It wasn't just the plane itself, though it was superb. It was the entire system behind it. American pilots arrived with hundreds of hours of training in the exact aircraft they'd fly in combat. German pilots were lucky to get 20 hours in a combat type before their first mission. Americans had unlimited fuel for training. Germans measured fuel in gallons, rationing it like medicine. Americans practiced gunnery until it became instinct. Germans could barely afford ammunition for combat, let alone training. The intelligence reports made for depressing reading. North American aviation was producing 20 Mustangs per day, 20 per day from a single factory, with other plants producing more. The latest variant had a bubble canopy for better visibility, an improved gun sight, better armor protection. Meanwhile, Germany was building fighters in caves and forests, using slave labor and substitute materials, producing machines that were shadows of their design specifications. Major Gunther Lutzow read the letter from his wife for the third time, trying to find hope between the lines. She wrote about food shortages, air raid sirens, their son asking when Daddy would come home. She didn't write about the bombs that fell like rain, the refugees streaming west, the certainty that Soviet armies would soon do to Germany what Germany had done to Russia. She didn't need to. Every German soldier knew what was coming, fought not for victory, but to delay the inevitable. Lutzow had been an ace when that word meant something, back when individual skill could turn a battle. Now he was a relic, one of the few pilots from the glory days still alive. He'd survived by being good, lucky, and increasingly by avoiding combat when possible, not from cowardice, but from pragmatism. Every experienced pilot lost was irreplaceable. Every Mustang shot down would be replaced within days, its pilot replaced within weeks. The mathematics of modern war had no room for heroes. His last encounter with Mustangs had been educational in the worst way. Leading 6 fighters to intercept bombers over Hanover, he'd been jumped by what seemed like half the American Air Force. Mustangs from above, Mustangs from below, Mustangs everywhere he looked. His flight had lasted 90 seconds. He'd survived by abandoning every principle of leadership, diving for the deck while his wingman died, using his experience to escape while they were slaughtered. The shame was worse than any wound, but dead leaders couldn't train the next generation, assuming there was a next generation. The Mustang represented everything Germany had failed to understand about modern warfare. It wasn't about building the perfect fighter. It was about building a good enough fighter in overwhelming numbers, training competent pilots efficiently, creating a system that could absorb losses and keep functioning. The Americans had learned that lesson. Germany, obsessed with technical perfection and individual heroism, had learned it too late. Captain Franz Stiegler walked through the remains of his squadron's ready room, stepping over broken glass and scattered paperwork. Yesterday, this had been an operational fighter base. Today, after a visit from Mustang fighter bombers, it was scrap metal and memories. 8 pilots dead, 12 aircraft destroyed, fuel depot burning with flames that would last for days. The Americans had lost 1 plane to ground fire, its pilot probably already back in England, telling stories over warm beer. Stiegler had 28 confirmed kills. Would have had more if he'd been the type to shoot at parachutes or damaged aircraft. He'd never forgotten his commander's words from 1940. "If you shoot at a man in a parachute, I will shoot you myself. We are knights of the air, not murderers." That chivalry seemed antiquated now, when American fighter bombers strafed anything that moved, when area bombing turned entire cities into funeral pyres. The Mustang pilots weren't knights. They were technicians, applying violence with industrial efficiency. He'd nearly died 3 times in encounters with Mustangs, saved each time by experience and luck, running out for someone else first. The American pilots were good, not brilliant, not inspired, just consistently, reliably good. They flew by the book, and the book was written by people who'd studied every German tactic, every strength and weakness, every habit and pattern. Fighting them was like playing chess against someone who'd memorized every possible move. You might surprise them once, but they'd adapt, share the information, ensure that surprise never worked again. The worst part was knowing it was all pointless. Even if by some miracle Germany produced a fighter superior to the Mustang, there was no fuel to fly it, no pilots to train on it, no factories safe from bombing to build it. The war was a mathematical equation that had been solved months ago. Everything since was just the long, painful process of reaching the inevitable answer. The Mustang hadn't won the war. American production capacity had won it. The Mustang was just the tool, perfect for its purpose, turning air superiority into air dominance into air supremacy. Lieutenant Heinz Knoke stood beside his crashed Messerschmitt, watching it burn, feeling oddly relieved. No more dawn patrols against impossible odds. No more watching friends die for a cause everyone knew was lost. No more pretending that courage could overcome arithmetic. The Mustang that had shot him down circled once. Pilot checking his kill was confirmed, then headed west to rejoin his squadron. Professional, efficient, no malice or glory-seeking. Just another day at work for the American pilot. Knoke had been flying for 2 years, had 19 confirmed kills, had thought himself a good pilot until he met his first Mustang. That encounter had been educational. The American had advantages Knoke couldn't match. Better airplane, better training, better support, better everything. But more than that, the American had something Knoke had lost: belief in victory. The American knew he was going to win, flew with the confidence of inevitable triumph. Knoke flew with the desperation of inevitable defeat, and desperation made you predictable, made you take chances, made you dead. The Luftwaffe had started the war with the best pilots in the world, flying the best fighters in the world, using the best tactics in the world. They'd conquered Europe's skies in months, driven the RAF to the brink, scored victories that seemed impossible. Then they'd met American industrial power, married to British experience and Soviet endurance. The Mustang was the child of that marriage, combining American engineering, British aerodynamics, and lessons learned from every air battle from Spain to Stalingrad. Walking away from his burning fighter, Knoke thought about the propaganda he'd grown up with, the promises of German technical superiority, the myth of the invincible Luftwaffe. All lies, or at best, temporary truths overtaken by events. The Mustang had exposed those lies with brutal clarity. Germany could build excellent fighters in small numbers. America could build good fighters in infinite numbers. Excellence times 10 couldn't defeat good times 1,000. Every German pilot had learned that equation, usually in the last seconds of their lives. Major Adolf Galland read the reports with growing despair. Yesterday's losses: 43 fighters, 31 pilots killed, 12 wounded. American losses: 4 Mustangs, 2 pilots killed, 2 captured. The ratios were getting worse, not better. Experience wasn't accumulating because experienced pilots weren't surviving. Training was collapsing because training facilities were being destroyed faster than they could be rebuilt. The Luftwaffe wasn't being defeated, it was being erased. Galland had been flying fighters since Spain, had 104 confirmed kills, had commanded fighter wings when Germany ruled European skies. He'd met every Allied fighter from the Hurricane to the Thunderbolt, had developed tactics to defeat them all. Then came the Mustang, and everything changed. It wasn't revolutionary, didn't introduce new technology, didn't break the rules of physics. It just did everything well enough, reliably enough, in large enough numbers to render German air power irrelevant. He'd argued for months that Germany needed to focus on building one type of fighter in maximum numbers, the way Americans mass-produced Mustangs. Instead, Germany pursued a dozen different designs, wasting resources on technical perfection while Americans achieved practical dominance. The Me-262 jet was a marvel, but Germany could build 10 jets while America built 1,000 Mustangs. The Focke-Wulf Ta-152 was superior to the Mustang at high altitude, but there were only 40 of them versus 4,000 Mustangs over Europe. The truth Galland couldn't write in his reports was that the war in the air had been lost before the Mustang arrived. Germany had lost it by declaring war on America, by fighting on multiple fronts, by believing that quality could overcome quantity indefinitely. The Mustang was just the exclamation point at the end of a sentence written at Pearl Harbor. When American production capacity was finally directed at destroying the Luftwaffe, the outcome was never in doubt. The only variable was how many Germans would die before accepting reality. Standing on the balcony of his headquarters, watching contrails of Mustangs escorting bombers toward Berlin, Galland remembered something Göring had said when they'd first heard about American fighter production goals. If those numbers are real, we've lost the war. The numbers were real. The war was lost. The Mustang proved it every day, a silver messenger of industrial democracy, defeating everything German totalitarianism could produce. There was something almost poetic about it, if you could appreciate poetry while your country burned. Colonel Gustav Rödel briefed his pilots for what everyone knew was a suicide mission, 8 fighters against 300 bombers and 200 escorts. The target was the synthetic oil plant at Luna, Germany's last major source of aviation fuel. If it was destroyed, the Luftwaffe would be grounded within weeks. Not that it mattered. Most planes were already grounded for lack of fuel, lack of parts, lack of pilots, lack of hope. The young faces staring back at him were heartbreaking. Average age 19, average experience 20 hours. They'd grown up on propaganda about German superiority, still believed skill and courage could overcome any odds. They hadn't yet learned that courage without fuel was useless, that skill without ammunition was meaningless, that the best pilot in the world couldn't fight when outnumbered 50-1. Rödel had been flying since 1938, had 97 confirmed kills, had fought in every major campaign. He'd seen the Luftwaffe at its peak when German fighters swept everything from the sky, when being a fighter pilot meant glory and survival. Now it meant dying for a lost cause, probably in the first 30 seconds of combat, probably without ever seeing the Mustang that killed you. He didn't tell them about his last encounter with Mustangs, when his entire squadron had been destroyed in 4 minutes. Didn't tell them about finding his best friend's body in a crashed Messerschmitt, burned beyond recognition except for his wedding ring. Didn't tell them that American pilots had stopped taking risks, were content to use their overwhelming numerical superiority to grind down German resistance through attrition. Just told them to do their duty, fly their mission, trust in their training. All lies, but perhaps kinder than truth. Taking off into a sky that belonged to America, Rödel wondered if future historians would understand what it had been like, fighting against impossible odds with obsolete equipment and children for pilots. Would they understand the peculiar courage required to keep fighting when victory was impossible, when the best you could hope for was dying well? The Mustang had made heroes obsolete, turned air combat into an industrial process where individual excellence was irrelevant. But still they flew these last nights of a dying Reich, because the alternative was accepting defeat, and they'd been taught that defeat was worse than death. Major Erich Hartmann, the Luftwaffe's greatest ace with 352 confirmed kills, watched Mustangs circle the airfield like vultures, waiting for anyone stupid enough to attempt takeoff. He had fuel for one mission, ammunition for one engagement, and orders that made no sense. Attack the bombers at all costs. What costs? They'd already paid everything: friends, comrades, hope, dignity. All that remained was the dying. Hartmann had survived longer than anyone by being better than everyone, by understanding energy and angles and timing with instinctive perfection. But perfection meant nothing when you were outnumbered 30-1, when enemy pilots were competent and careful and backed by unlimited resources. He'd shot down 7 Mustangs, more than any other German pilot, but it was like bailing water from a sinking ship with a teaspoon. For every Mustang destroyed, 10 more appeared. The intelligence officer had shown him captured American training materials. Their pilots practiced against instructors flying captured German aircraft, learned every strength and weakness, developed specific tactics for specific situations. They flew mock missions over terrain that resembled Germany, practiced escort duties until it became routine, learned to think like bomber crews so they could better protect them. It was systematic, thorough, utterly professional. The Americans had turned air combat into a science, while Germans still thought of it as an art. Starting his engine, watching fuel gauge already dropping, Hartmann knew this might be his last flight. The odds said he should have been dead 50 missions ago. Every survival was borrowed time, every victory a statistical anomaly. The Mustang had changed the mathematics of air combat. Before, a great pilot could dominate the sky, turn the tide of battle through individual brilliance. Now, great pilots died like average ones, just took a few seconds longer. The Democratic bomber offensive, protected by Democratic fighters flown by Democratic pilots, was defeating the supposed supermen of the master race. There was a lesson there, if anyone survived to learn it. Captain Wolfgang Spata led 4 fighters toward the bomber stream, climbing through 20,000 feet when the Mustangs found them. Always from above, always from the sun, always with numerical superiority. The American leader waggled his wings, a signal Spate had seen before: surrender or die. Some German pilots had started accepting the offer, landing at Allied fields, choosing captivity over certain death. Spate considered it for about 2 seconds, then pushed his throttle forward. Better to die flying than live with shame. The engagement lasted 45 seconds. 2 of his pilots died in the first pass, caught in a crossfire between 4 Mustangs attacking from different angles. The third tried to run, dove for the deck, was followed down by 2 Americans who killed him at 500 feet. Spate lasted longest, using every trick learned in 300 combat missions, making the Americans work for their kill. His ammunition ran out first, then his options, then his luck. The Mustang that killed him was flown by a 20-year-old from Ohio who'd been in combat for 3 weeks. Experience versus numbers. Numbers won. Watching from 10 miles away, General Joseph Kamhuber, architect of Germany's night fighter force, saw the last of his day fighters destroyed. He'd started the war with 800 fighters. He now commanded 12, half of them unserviceable. The pilots were dead, wounded, or captured. The mechanics were drafted into the infantry. The airfields were craters. The fuel was gone. The ammunition was gone. The hope was gone. The Mustang hadn't destroyed the Luftwaffe. It had performed its autopsy. Lieutenant Colonel Heinz Baer stood in the ruins of the aircraft factory at Regensburg, looking at the twisted remains of what should have been Germany's next-generation fighter. The Americans had visited yesterday, B-17s escorted by Mustangs that strafed anything that survived the bombing. The precision was remarkable. Every building destroyed, every machine tool wrecked, every blueprint burned. American intelligence knew exactly what was being built here, exactly where to hit, exactly how to ensure it would never fly. Baer had 221 confirmed kills, 16 of them in the Me-262 jet fighter. He'd flown everything Germany produced, had tested experimental aircraft that existed only as prototypes. He understood aircraft design, understood what made one fighter superior to another, understood why the Mustang dominated European skies. It wasn't the best at anything, but it was good enough at everything. More importantly, it could be mass-produced by workers who'd never built an airplane before, maintained by mechanics with basic training, flown by pilots with standard skills. Germany had pursued perfection and achieved remarkable designs that couldn't be mass-produced. America had pursued adequacy and achieved air supremacy. The lesson was clear, but came too late. Wars weren't won by building the best fighter. They were won by building the most fighters that were good enough. The Mustang was good enough times 5,000. The Messerschmitt was excellent times 500. The mathematics were inexorable. The factory supervisor, an old man who'd been building aircraft since 1915, stood beside him. "We could have built 2,000 fighters with the resources wasted on experimental programs," he said. "Simple fighters, reliable fighters, fighters we could produce with available materials and workers." But Germany had been seduced by technical superiority, by the promise of wonder weapons, by the belief that German engineering could overcome any disadvantage. The Mustang proved that belief false. It was American engineering at its best, not brilliant but practical, not perfect but producible, not revolutionary but evolutionary. Walking through the wreckage, Bear remembered his first flight in a Mustang they'd captured intact. The controls were smooth, responsive, predictable. The engine ran perfectly despite minimal maintenance. The guns fired every time you pulled the trigger. Everything worked exactly as designed. No quirks, no temperament, no special techniques required. It was an airplane built for war, not for peacetime air shows. Built to be flown by thousands of average pilots, not dozens of experts. Built to win through quantity without sacrificing enough quality to matter. Major Gerhard Michalski stood beside his Messerschmitt, out of fuel after a 6-minute engagement with Mustangs. 6 minutes from takeoff to empty tanks, never even saw the bombers he was supposed to attack. The Americans had perfected the art of the fighter sweep, sending Mustangs ahead of the bombers to clear the sky, force German fighters to waste fuel in combat maneuvering, ensure they'd never reach the bomber stream. It was tactical brilliance achieved through numerical superiority. When you could afford to dedicate 50 fighters just to keeping enemy fighters busy, you'd already won. Michalski had 73 confirmed kills, most from the Eastern Front, where individual skill still mattered. Against the Soviets, you could exploit their aggressive tactics, their willingness to trade aircraft for objectives. Against the Americans, there was nothing to exploit. They flew with discipline, patience, overwhelming firepower. They didn't seek glory, didn't take unnecessary risks, didn't care about being aces. They cared about completing the mission, protecting the bombers, grinding down German resistance through systematic attrition. His crew chief approached with the fuel report. 3 gallons of aviation gas remaining on the entire field. 3 gallons. Not enough for a single combat sortie. The synthetic fuel plants were gone, destroyed by the bombers the Mustangs protected so effectively. The Romanian oil fields were in Soviet hands. The reserves were exhausted. Germany's most advanced fighters were being destroyed on the ground, not by enemy action, but by lack of fuel to fly them. The Mustang had won by making itself essential to the bombing campaign that destroyed Germany's ability to resist. The irony was bitter. Germany had invented modern air warfare, had pioneered dive bombing, had developed the first operational jet fighter. But they'd failed to understand that modern war was about production and logistics more than tactics and technology. The Mustang embodied that understanding. It could fly from England to Poland and back. German fighters could barely reach England's coast. It could be maintained with basic tools and spare parts. German fighters needed specialized equipment and custom components. It burned regular gasoline. German fighters needed high-octane fuel that barely existed anymore. Standing in the empty hangar, Michalski remembered 1940, when the Luftwaffe seemed invincible, when German fighters ruled from the Atlantic to the Urals. 4 years later, they couldn't control the airspace over their own airfields. The Mustang hadn't caused that collapse, but it had accelerated it beyond recovery. Every B-17 that reached its target because of Mustang protection was another nail in Germany's coffin. Every German fighter shot down by Mustangs was irreplaceable. Every day the Americans grew stronger while Germany grew weaker, and the Mustang was the tool that ensured that progression continued. Colonel Herbert Ehlfeld watched from his command bunker as Mustangs strafed the airfield for the third time this week. They came in low and fast, 4 at a time, one flight attacking while another provided cover. Professional, methodical, devastating. His last 3 serviceable fighters burned in their revetments. 2 mechanics died trying to save them. The fuel dump exploded in a fireball visible for 10 miles. The Americans lost nothing, would be back tomorrow or the next day to destroy whatever was rebuilt. Ehlfeld had 130 confirmed kills, had flown in Spain before the war, had been one of the Luftwaffe's first aces. He'd fought Spitfires over London, Hurricanes over Malta, Thunderbolts over France. The Mustang was different. It wasn't trying to win dogfights or prove superiority. It was a tool for winning the war through systematic destruction of German capability. Every Mustang pilot was part of a vast machine designed to deliver bombs to German targets. Their job was to ensure those bombs arrived. They did their job with ruthless efficiency. The change in American tactics had been remarkable to watch. In 1943, their fighter pilots had been eager, aggressive, looking for combat. By 1944, they'd learned patience, discipline, the value of living to fight another day. They'd studied German tactics, developed counters, shared information across all units. When one squadron found a successful tactic, every squadron knew about it within days. When one pilot discovered a weakness, every pilot was briefed. It was collective learning at industrial scale, the same principle that made their factories so efficient. German pilots still flew as individuals, relied on personal skill and experience. American pilots flew as components of a larger system, each playing a specific role. The results spoke for themselves. Individual German aces might shoot down more planes, but American squadrons accomplished their missions. Protecting bombers wasn't glorious, but it won wars. The Mustang was the perfect aircraft for that philosophy, not a dueling sword, but a reliable tool for strategic victory. The intelligence reports made for grim reading. Current American production, 22 Mustangs per day. Current German production of all fighter types, 15 per day. American pilot training program, 300 hours minimum before combat. German pilot training, 40 hours if lucky. American fuel reserves, essentially unlimited. German fuel reserves, 2 weeks at current consumption. The war wasn't being lost. It had been lost months ago. Everything since was just the process of dying. Captain Gunther Schack led his last mission with 2 bullets in his shoulder and a temperature of 102 degrees. The medical officer had tried to ground him, but there was nobody else. The other pilots were dead, wounded, or too inexperienced to lead. The mission was pointless, 4 fighters against 1,000 plane raid, but orders were orders. They took off, knowing they wouldn't all come back, probably none of them would. The Mustangs found them at 15,000 feet, climbing toward the bomber stream. 20 American fighters against 4 German. The odds weren't unusual anymore, might even be considered favorable by current standards. Schack had survived 174 missions by being careful, skillful, lucky. Today his luck ran out. The American 12 o'clock high attack was textbook perfect. 2 pilots died instantly. The third lasted maybe 10 seconds. Schack, despite wounds and fever, managed to evade for almost a minute before a burst of 50 caliber rounds removed his right wing. Falling in his spinning fighter, Schack had time to think about the war, about choices, about how Germany had come to this. They'd started with every advantage: experienced pilots, proven aircraft, tested tactics. They'd thrown it all away through hubris, overextension, the belief that will could overcome mathematics. The Mustang was mathematics made manifest. Each one represented American industrial capacity, training capability, logistical superiority. Germany could build fighters that were works of art. America built fighters that won wars. His parachute opened at 2,000 feet. Looking up, he saw the Mustangs regrouping, heading back to escort their bombers. No victory rolls, no celebration. Just professionals completing their mission. One of them circled him once, checking he was alive in his chute, then rejoined formation. There was something almost respectful about it, professional courtesy between airmen, or maybe just ensuring he was truly out of the war, one less German pilot to face tomorrow. Landing in a turnip field, leg broken, shoulder bleeding, Shack watched the bomber stream pass overhead. 1,000 planes, maybe more, each carrying tons of bombs, heading for Munich or Stuttgart or wherever today's target was. The Mustangs weaved above them, silver sharks protecting their school of whales. It was magnificent and terrible, democracy's arsenal demonstrating that individual heroism couldn't defeat collective power. The age of aces was over, the age of air power as industrial process had begun. Major Hans-Joachim Marseille would have been 25 today had he survived. Hauptmann Hans Philipp would have been 28. Major Helmut Wick would have been 30. The list of dead aces filled pages, Germany's best pilots gone before the Mustang even arrived. Those who remained faced an enemy that had learned from every German victory, studied every German tactic, turned air combat into science. The Mustang was the culmination of that learning, the perfect synthesis of Allied experience and American production. General der Jagdflieger Adolf Galland stood before the assembled commanders of what remained of the German fighter force. 15 officers commanding paper squadrons, ghost groups, phantom wings. Their total operational strength, 43 fighters across the entire Western Front. The Americans had 1,500 Mustangs in England alone, with more arriving weekly. The briefing was supposed to be about new tactics to counter the Mustang threat. Everyone knew there were no new tactics, no counters, no hope. "Gentlemen," Galland began, then stopped. What could he say that mattered? That they should die bravely. They were already doing that. That victory was possible. Nobody would believe it. That their sacrifice had meaning. Even that was questionable. The Mustang hadn't just defeated the Luftwaffe's fighters, it had invalidated the entire concept of air superiority through individual excellence that Germany had pioneered. He'd flown a captured Mustang extensively, looking for weaknesses to exploit. The aircraft was superb. Not perfect, but perfectly adequate for its mission. It could escort bombers from England to Berlin and back with fuel to spare for combat. It could carry bombs itself, turning into a fighter-bomber after escort duty. It could operate from rough fields, fly in terrible weather, survive battle damage that would destroy a Messerschmitt. Most importantly, it could be flown effectively by pilots with modest skills, while German fighters increasingly required experts just to take off safely. The room was silent, officers staring at maps showing the inexorable Allied advance. In the east, Soviet forces pushed toward Berlin. In the west, Americans and British had crossed the Rhine. In the air, Mustangs ruled absolutely. The war had multiple endings, but only one conclusion: Germany would lose, was losing, had lost. The only variable was how many more would die before accepting that reality. "Our duty," Galland finally said, "is to preserve what we can for the future. Save your experienced pilots when possible. Preserve aircraft when you can. Document what we've learned. Someday, someone will want to know how the world's premier air force was reduced to this. Tell them about courage against impossible odds. Tell them about teenage pilots fighting when victory was impossible. Tell them about the Mustang and how it proved that wars are won by nations, not individuals." Lieutenant Stefan Litjens made his first and last combat flight on April 25, 1945. 17 years old, 15 hours total flight time, 8 hours in a Messerschmitt. His instructor had been killed yesterday, shot down by Mustangs while trying to teach another student basic combat maneuvers. There was no fuel for proper training, no ammunition for gunnery practice, no time for anything but desperate improvisation. Taking off from a highway near Munich, The airfield had been destroyed weeks ago. Litjens climbed toward where he thought enemy aircraft might be. His radio didn't work. His gun sight was broken. His engine ran rough from low-quality fuel. He was flying a dying machine for a dead regime, but he was 17 and still believed in duty, honor, country, abstractions that meant nothing to the Mustang pilots who found him at 8,000 feet. 4 Americans flying in perfect formation, equipment working perfectly, hundreds of hours of experience each. They could have killed him instantly, but seemed to recognize his inexperience, his terror, his helplessness. The flight leader waggled his wings, the universal signal for "follow us or die." Litjens considered fighting, remembered his dead instructor's last words, "Don't die for nothing. Germany needs living witnesses, not dead heroes." He followed the Mustangs west, crossing into American-controlled territory, landing at a former Luftwaffe base now operated by the U.S. Army Air Forces. The Americans were professional, almost kind. They knew the war was over, knew this teenager was no threat, knew they'd won so completely that magnanimity cost nothing. One of them, a captain from Texas, spoke enough German to say, "You're lucky. 2 more days, and there won't be anywhere left to land." Standing beside his surrendered Messerschmitt, watching Mustangs take off for missions over what remained of the Reich, Litjens understood what older pilots had been trying to tell him. The war hadn't been lost in the last days or even the last years. It had been lost the moment America entered, bringing industrial capacity Germany couldn't match, training programs Germany couldn't replicate, and eventually fighters like the Mustang that turned air superiority into air supremacy. Individual courage meant nothing against systemic superiority. The age of heroes was over. The age of systems had begun. On May 7, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The Luftwaffe that had once terrorized Europe ceased to exist. Of the 30,000 pilots who'd flown for Germany during the war, fewer than 1,000 remained alive and uncaptured. The Mustang hadn't killed them all, many died before it arrived, but it had ensured their sacrifice meant nothing. Every strategic target they died defending was destroyed. Every city they'd tried to protect was in ruins. Every promise of victory had proven false. The last German fighter pilot to die in combat was Oberfähnrich Fritz Behrens, shot down by Mustangs on May 8, 1945, hours after the official surrender. He either hadn't heard about the capitulation or chose to ignore it. The Americans who killed him reported it as a routine engagement. No drama, no heroics, just the final period at the end of a sentence written in blood and aluminum. The Mustang had done its job with ruthless efficiency. Germany's 1,000-year Reich had lasted 12 years. America's aerial supremacy would last for generations. In the immediate aftermath, captured German pilots were extensively debriefed about their experiences fighting Mustangs. Their reports were remarkably consistent. The aircraft itself was excellent, but not miraculous. What made it devastating was the system behind it, the training, the tactics, the numbers, the logistics. One pilot summarized it perfectly. You could shoot down a Mustang, but you couldn't shoot down the factory that built it, the school that trained its pilot, the tanker that brought its fuel. We were fighting aircraft. They were fighting with an entire nation. Some German aces survived to fly again in peacetime, test pilots and airline captains carrying passengers instead of ammunition. They spoke reluctantly about the war, even more reluctantly about its end. When pressed about the Mustang, most would say something like, "It was a fine aircraft flown by brave men." What they didn't say, what hurt too much to articulate, was that it had proven everything they'd believed about air combat wrong. Individual skill mattered less than industrial capacity. Courage mattered less than logistics. Heroes mattered less than systems. The Mustang continued flying long after the war, serving in Korea, sold to Allied nations, racing at air shows. German pilots who'd faced them in combat would sometimes see them at these peaceful gatherings, silver ghosts of democracy's triumph. Some could admire them objectively, appreciating their engineering elegance. Others couldn't bear to look, remembering friends burned alive in their cockpits, remembering the helplessness of facing impossible odds, remembering when the sky belonged to Germany until the day it didn't. The story of German pilots meeting the P-51 Mustang is ultimately a story about the end of an era. The era when individual pilots could change history, when personal courage could overcome material disadvantage, when skill mattered more than numbers. The Mustang represented the new age, industrial warfare, systematic destruction, victory through production. It wasn't the plane that defeated Germany, it was what the plane represented: America's ability to mass-produce excellence, to turn war into an industrial process, to replace romance with efficiency. Years later, a former Luftwaffe general was asked what would have happened if Germany had developed the Mustang instead of America. He laughed bitterly and replied, "We would have built 100 perfect ones instead of 5,000 good ones, and we still would have lost." That was the lesson of the Mustang, the lesson Germany learned too late. In modern war, good enough in vast numbers beats perfect in small numbers every time. The Mustang was good enough, and there were thousands of them. The Messerschmitt might have been better, but there were hundreds. The mathematics were simple. The results were inevitable. The sky belonged to whoever could fill it with the most planes that were good enough to win. America could. Germany couldn't. The Mustang proved it every day from 1944 until the end. Thanks for joining us on this journey through one of history's incredible survival stories. If you found it compelling, give it a like and share it with someone who appreciates these tales of courage. And don't forget to subscribe for more.